Today I present you with a nice little family of Voodoo cards. So I've got 3 Voodoo cards here, and the first one is the Voodoo Banshee, which is dear to my heart because this was the only 3DFX card I actually ever owned back in the day and used in real time. So this one is the same model that I owned back then, a Maxi Gamer Phoenix 16MB Voodoo Banshee card, so the first successful combined 2D 3D card from 3DFX after the failure of the Voodoo Rush. The Banshee came out in the summer of 1998, and then the next card that 3DFX produced a year later was this, and this is not even called a Voodoo. It's an STB Velocity 100. It was a card that I wasn't that familiar with. It was a fairly cheap buy on eBay and apparently has some interesting potential, but it looks to me like it continues. It's the same feel, same like kind of target audience as the Banshee, and I wondered how they might relate to each other and what the thought process might have been for releasing this card. And then continuing on to the next card, we get into the Voodoo 3 range. So there was a couple of weird sort of steps in between. There was a Velocity 200 mooted, whether or not that actually appeared or not, I'm not sure, so I might look into that in a few minutes. And then, of course, we settle on the Voodoo 3 range that everybody loves and uses and seeks out these days. So here we've got a Voodoo 3 2000. Apparently there was a 1000 in between, which was an OEM card, Compaq, I think, were the people who released that, but never really see them around. But then there's a kind of relationship between the Velocity 100 and the Voodoo 1000/2000 as well, so I thought it'd be interesting to take a look at that too. I hooked up a nice slot A motherboard, so there's a clue there to an up-and-coming project, but I got this off eBay and it needs testing, so I thought this was a good time to do it. So we'll be plugging these cards into this and seeing what they can do. Banshee's going first. We'll stick it in and run a few benchmarks and see what we've got. The Banshee's a bit of a weird card. It's like an experiment just to prove that 3DFX can actually produce a card with 2D and 3D on the same board after the failure of the Voodoo Rush. The Banshee follows the well-respected Voodoo 2, and indeed it uses the same 3D core as the Voodoo 2. It only has 1 texture mapping unit, whereas the Voodoo 2 has 2, and 3DFX kind of compensated for this by bumping all of the clocks on the Banshee, so it's got 100 MHz core clock and 100 MHz memory clock, whereas the Voodoo 2 only had 90 in each case. So this thing gives the Voodoo 2 a run for its money on games that only require single textures, but if you get into sort of games that require multiple textures on a single pass, then the Voodoo 2 just rips ahead. So it's a weird card. You kind of expect a follow-on card to be better than the previous model, but not really the case here. The memory was also SG RAM, whereas the Voodoo 2 uses EDO RAM. I'll get the Banshee drivers on. So basically what I'm going to do here is load the drivers, run some benches, wipe everything back to original state Windows 98, and then repeat that 3 times, and we'll see how they compare with each other. I have the original driver disk and manual for this, which is nice. I'm not going to get too into using the latest drivers. I'm just going to use the sort of best ones. So I'm going to use this just because it might be optimized to the Guillemot card. So first up, I'm going to use 3D Mark 99, and I'm going to run it 3 times, once at 640 by 480, once at 800 by 600, and then once at 1024 by 768, and I'm going to do that for all 3 cards on every bench that I do. So at the end of the first run, we've got a 3D Mark score of 3199, so sounds like an excuse to put it on a funky little graph to me, so that's exactly what we're going to do, and we'll just keep adding and see how things look at the end of that. So only the resolution's been changed for these benchmarks, none of the other settings, and of course all of the colour is only set to 16-bit because that's all that these cards can do. Possibly part of the reason why Voodoo kind of faded away and screwed up was the Voodoo 3 could only do 16-bit colour and couldn't handle large textures, and then suddenly it found itself having to compete with the likes of the Riva TNT2, which could do those things, and that was clearly the way of the future. And there we have the baseline for this benchmarking in 3D Mark 99. So what we're going to do here is do each card in turn inside 3D Mark, and we'll see how they compare there. And also we're going to do some benchmarking in Quake II and some benchmarking in Unreal Tournament, and then some general gameplay just to get a feel to see if there's any difference between the cards when it's a real world experience as opposed to sort of synthetic benchmarking. So the next card, our Velocity 100, is in, and we've got the drivers installed after wiping everything down to Windows 98 again, and now we're going to run those same benchmarks in 3D Mark 99. Now in this case I've downloaded some Voodoo tools and an overclocking utility which allow me to disable VSync on the Velocity 100, because obviously you don't want it to be syncing in with the monitor's vertical resolution. Something I didn't do on the Banshee, because to be honest I couldn't figure out how to do it on the Banshee. So what I'm kind of hoping with the Banshee is it's going to be slow enough. This monitor's a 75 Hz monitor, or range between 60 and 75 on the resolutions we're using, so I'm hoping the Banshee's going to be slow enough not to hit that cap, but we'll find out soon enough. No, it doesn't look like it's going to be a fair competition. So the Banshee was getting kind of in the 20s for its frame rates in some of those demos, like the first-person shooter and the racing one, whereas we're getting kind of in the 80s here with this Velocity 100. Now, I thought they'd be closer because I thought the hardware was more closely related, because I think it's called the Avenger architecture that they use in the Velocity 100, which is also used in the Voodoo 3. And I do believe this is still an evolution of the original Voodoo 2 3D core. So the Velocity 100 and the Voodoo 3 were quite heavily based on the Banshee, but obviously the clock rates are much higher here, and possibly there's some other shenanigans going on that they've sort of enhanced inside the processor, but even with less memory, the Velocity 100 trounces the Banshee at this resolution. So we're looking at the final bench now for the Velocity 100, 1024 by 768, and that gives us our second set of data. And yeah, not as close as I thought it was going to be, so maybe the relationship between the Banshee and the Velocity 100 isn't as close as I thought it was. It is interesting though that as the resolution goes up, the gap gets closer between the Banshee and the Velocity 100. In goes the Voodoo 3 2000. So the relationship between the Voodoo 3 2000 and the Velocity 100 is kind of similar to that between the Banshee and the Voodoo 2 that we were talking about earlier. So here we've got a Voodoo 3 which has got 16 megabytes of, I think, SD RAM and 2 texture mapping units, whereas the Velocity 100 has 8 megabytes of SG RAM and only has 1 texture mapping unit. So in something like 3D Mark 99, where it possibly doesn't care too much about doing multiple textures on a single pass, these cards might be closer than you think, but let's find out. No, this doesn't look quite right. I did disable VSync, but it was getting much higher frame rates than the monitor would have locked it at anyway, so that doesn't seem to be an issue. But yeah, this thing's coming in slightly slower than the Velocity 100, so maybe I've got crappy drivers, not really sure. So 800 by 600, it comes in at pretty close to the same as the Velocity 100, still slightly slower, but the gap's closed quite a bit, so yeah. Finally, on 1024 by 768, at long last, the Voodoo 3 eases ahead of the Velocity 100. So it goes to show these cards are essentially the same card, and we're probably not looking at using 2 TMUs in a lot of these tests, and so essentially they're evenly matched, and possibly not even using, there's not even the need for the 16 megabytes of memory. In the end, that probably helped get it over the line first when it came to the higher resolution. There you go. A tale of 3 Voodoos. But hold your horses, we're not done yet. It's not really a tale of 3 Voodoos, it's a tale of 3.5 Voodoos. And that's because the Velocity 100 has a hidden trick up its sleeve. And that being that it was sold and coming out of the box with a single texture mapping unit, but it really has 2. In effect, it's actually a Voodoo 3 2000 card, albeit with 8 megabytes of RAM instead of 16 megabytes of RAM, and there's a registry hack you can perform to re-enable the second TMU, and then suddenly you have a Voodoo 3 2000 on your hands with slightly less memory. So we're going to enable the second TMU and quickly run these benches again and see how that looks, if it makes any difference at all in 3D Mark 99, I'm not sure. So no difference at all. The Velocity 100 with 2 TMUs exactly matches. Slight differences, tiny differences in frame rate. The Velocity 100 without the extra TMU, so didn't really show anything in this test. Maybe we'll see some difference when we come to do some of the gaming benchmarks. Okay, wipe the slate clean as far as graphs are concerned, and now we're going to do a bit of gaming benchmarking using Quake II. So back in the day there was this level, this map written by a guy who went by the handle of Three Fingers. It's called the Crusher time demo, and basically it's a very, very busy level with a lot going on, and it really pushes the system. So we're going to run that on the 3 cards and see what it looks like. Hopefully we'll see some difference between the TMU settings and this one. Banshee's up first, running at 640 by 480, and then we'll get the graph going again. Then we've got our Velocity 100. We set this back to only use 1 TMU. So this kind of gives you a clearer picture. The Velocity 100's about 10 frames a second higher than the Banshee, and the Banshee's totally playable. It's doing alright, 30 frames a second, and the Velocity 100 with a single TMU comes in at 40 frames a second. So then next up is the Voodoo 3. Let's see how that does. So yeah, this is more like the performance spread I was expecting to see on some of the 3D Mark 99. Everything's kind of in order. You've got a whole another 20 frames a second jump between the Velocity 100 and the Voodoo 3 2000, which implies that the TMUs are probably being used, both of them. So let's get the other one enabled on the Velocity 100 and see if we can get that a bit closer. And that kind of proves it. Look at that. You enable the second TMU and the Velocity 100 now exactly tracks the Voodoo 3 2000. So it's basically become a Voodoo 3 2000 with a bit less memory. Unfortunately, that kind of wrapped up the Quake II testing because the Velocity 100 didn't want to go to higher resolutions. It caused all sorts of hangs, and initially I thought it might just be to do with the Crusher demo level, so I tried running the time demo just using one of the normal demo levels, and the same thing happened again. The thing just froze and wouldn't run, so it seemed pointless to continue and just do the tests on the Banshee and the Voodoo 3 2000. It's possibly just a driver issue, and I could have tried some different drivers, but I'm just going to knock it on the head for there. I think it demonstrates and it proves a point that the TMUs are both used in this time demo, and it has clearly shown the difference between switching the TMU on and literally giving you a Velocity 100 to 2 TMUs literally becomes a Voodoo 3 2000 with a bit less memory. So if you want a Voodoo 3, I mean, these Velocity 100s do turn up for reasonable money compared to the real thing, and for as long as you're not pushing it into sort of later gaming, you're just getting the same thing for less money, so definitely a good buy, I think. Okay, one more quick gaming test. This time we're going to run through the intro of Unreal Tournament and put the frame counter on and see what that looks like. So because there's no sort of final result on this, it's just going to be a sort of guesstimate for looking for the highest average on each loop, and I let the thing play through about 3 times to let it settle a little bit. First up we've got the Banshee, and watching through the loop, 42 frames a second is about as fast as it gets. That's the average frame rate I'm going on. I mean, it jumps up. Some places it's running at about 70, some places it's running about 30, but 42 seemed to be the high point on the averages recorded there, so that's what we're going to put down for this, and that's our starting point. Okay, running at 800 by 600, it looks like the highest frame rate's around about 34, so that's the figure we're going to go with here, and that's the end of the benchmarking for the Banshee, because being a super organised human being, I've completely mislaid my 1024 by 768 footage for the Banshee, so that's all we're going to record for this. Next up we've got the Velocity 100 running at 640 by 480, and it looks like we got up to about 52 frames a second at the top average there. And in 800 by 600 the Velocity 100 got to about 50 as its sort of best average going through it. For most of the bit where it goes through the city, it was kind of hovering just below that, but 50 was its kind of top average for the main chunk of the demo. We got 42 at 1024 by 768, so it's a good bit faster than the Banshee. So as we go through this at various resolutions with the various cards, you can see, even though this test isn't as scientific as it was in Quake II, because the time demo in Quake II gives you a definitive result, here I just have to use my eyes to kind of try and spot the best average frame rate in each case, but the pattern looks the same. So the Banshee's a bit behind, which you kind of expect, but the Velocity 100 and the Voodoo 3 2000 trade blow for blow all the way up to 800 by 600, and it's only then that the Voodoo 3 2000 pulls away a little bit when we get to 1024 by 768. But as soon as you enable that second TMU, they're the same card basically, and they just run the same at all three resolutions. And you could probably see some difference if you kept on pushing the resolution up. I guess maybe the memory might come into play, the difference between the 8 megabytes and the 16 megabytes. But realistically, back in those days, you'd have been playing at 1024 by 768 on a 17-inch monitor, if you were lucky. So it's a pretty cool thing, and especially given that the Voodoo 3 2000 launched at about $150, I think, and the Velocity 100 launched at $50, so that's like a third of the price. And I believe 3DFX were fairly casual about releasing the information with the registry hack. So yeah, it was a bargain back then, and it's still potentially a bargain now, because I got my Velocity 100 for a fairly decent price on eBay. Registry hack, you've basically got a cheap Voodoo 3 2000. If you can find one, get one. So there you go, 3 cards of shared DNA. Possibly unfair to include the Banshee being a bit older, but the Banshee was where it all started. At the time the Banshee came out, 3DFX were working on a next generation core called Rampage, Project Rampage, and that was going to be something totally new and exciting. But the Banshee came out, 3DFX must have been really pleased to get a combined 2D 3D card out, especially after the failure of the Voodoo Rush. So they chose the easy route, which is always going to be a bad thing possibly, and they decided to ditch Rampage and develop something off the back of the Banshee that went on to become the Avenger graphics core, which eventually was what powered all of the Voodoo 3 range and the Velocity 100. So maybe a bad decision. That's why the Banshee deserves to be there though, because that's where the whole sort of idea was conceived from. But benchmarks are one thing and real life experience is another. While certainly when you run gaming benchmarks, it shows you the potential to push the system. But when you're playing a game, you know, if you're involved in the game, things like gameplay are kind of as important as graphics, and sometimes it just doesn't really matter that you're pushing all those pixels. I chose a 3DFX game, or a game that supports Glide, to test out these cards. So I chose Falcon 4, which is a flight simulator with some relatively sophisticated graphics for the time, and played through on each of these cards, including the Velocity 100 with both 1 and 2 TMUs made available. And to be honest, it was totally playable with all of the cards, possibly a little bit sort of blocky and stuttery. Well, you could definitely feel the Banshee wasn't as slick and as smooth as the other cards, but in all 3 varieties of Voodoo 3 2000 and the Velocity 100 in its 2 configurations, they were fine and I couldn't tell the difference. So I would happily have played games on any of these cards, and I actually did play this game on the Banshee back in the day. Haha, eat lead and die. Still satisfying after all of these years. That pretty much wraps it up for this video. I hope you enjoyed watching it and taking this little comparison trip with the Voodoo cards with that shared DNA, and seeing how some of the development took place around them. If you did enjoy watching, it'd be great if you consider giving me a thumbs up, subscribing, or leaving a comment below. And in the meantime, I'm going to go and play some Falcon 4. I hope to see you for the next video. Thanks for watching. Bye.